Good day, listeners. I'm Ryan Todd, the host of Beyond the Checkbox, where we check in with mental health leaders, talk about mental health, especially in the workplace, how we can improve it, how we can get better, what we can do to learn from these leaders. So today we checked in with the chief of police of a community called Prince Albert, and that chief of police, his name is Patrick Nogier. He has recently become the chief of police, and I wanted to bring him on because he has a tough job. This is a community that, can be a rough community. Let's call it what it is. And he has a lot of officers that he is responsible to. And we all know the pressures that police officers have been under in the last 5 years. And this is just getting worse and worse. As a practitioner, I see more officers who come in for mental health care. The stigma is being reduced, but the care is not quite meeting the demand and the need. So we wanted to talk about all these complexities, all these demands that he has on him as the chief of police, and the nuances that he is working with his police force and mental health. Because I think his perspective shows a couple of things. One, that the environment's getting more difficult to be an officer in, and there's more scrutiny, and there are more mental health situations or cases of long-term disability amongst officer groups, and that in itself is putting a lot of pressure on these police forces. So I really appreciated the chief of police coming on to the show to talk about this. And also there's a bit of taboo around it. Like, we don't often openly talk about these things. So we had a pretty open conversation. I loved it. I learned a ton. I hope you enjoy the show. As always, thank you for checking into Beyond the Checkbox. You are listening to Beyond the Checkbox, a podcast that focuses on leading strategies around bringing more mental well-being into the workplace. My name is Ryan Todd. I'm a psychiatrist and the CEO of Adversity. I'm sitting down with industry-leading change makers to break down their process and see how they are going above and beyond for their workforce mental well-being. We were talking about before the show really about there's a major difference between how you're seeing. First of all, I don't think there's any secret that officers are under the most strain that they've probably ever been, and the number of mental health situations, cases being seen. Is it fair to say that it's just continuously going up? Like, that's what I perceive from being like an outsider in that, but it seems like it's just more and more and more. Is that fair from your seat?
I think it is. That's one of the things that in this role that I have now as chief for the Prince Albert Police, one of the things that I really wanted to get into, more so now than ever before in my career, there's an expectation that I do what's best for the organization and the people that work within the organization. And coming from an organization where people are your strongest asset, we have to make sure it's incumbent upon us to ensure that we're doing everything we can to provide a safe work environment for people to thrive, not only on a professional level, but also on a personal level. So we started asking some, very pointed questions with WCB, Workers' Compensation Board for Saskatchewan. I came into this organization with a number of officers that were off on psychological stress-related injury and trying to do what we can to bring them back into the work environment. Now, that's only one component of it. Those are people that, we can say on a piece of paper that, they've been subjected to something that has harmed them, caused them some injury. And that's a little bit different than trying to go into that preventative measure, more on a upfront, upstream type of thing, to what can you do to make sure that the resiliency of the organization is increased as well. So, but to answer your point, yeah, we've seen a steady increase from 2017 on. It's just been on a natural progression where when we talk about injuries, mental health injuries, rather than actual physical injuries, are on the incline.
What is that? What's going on there?
Well, great question. Because when I go home and talk to family and friends, they ask me, well, what's so different than what a police officer is experiencing than somebody in other public safety response modes that are not? And I default to this, in that there's a certain, I'll not take anything away from any of the other professions, but there's a certain amount of unpredictability when our officers are going into an unknown territory. whether it be a house, whether it be a building, whether it be a back lane. And you're still dealing with the issues that require that intervention, but you're adding all the other complexity to it, unknown about an individual's disposition to react to a police officer, the uniform, the environment, whether you're dealing, are there other assailants that are in the area that are waiting to take advantage of that situation, access to weapons and disposition to use weapons against law enforcement in today's age. So that's what makes it really challenging, in particular for law enforcement personnel, from my perspective. And I understand that that's bias. I get it.
The social media has changed the game for officers, and body cameras. Like, let's put the entire movement aside, and of like the entire social justice movement. Let's put that to the side for now. Would you say that social media and just having cameras everywhere has changed things? And there's a positive in that, of course, that from the public's perspective, that rogue officers are more accountable now. The negative is that the pressure has increased. It must have increased tenfold for officers.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say, is although a body camera or an in-car camera system gives the impression of accountability and transparency, what it fails to do is it fails to go deeper into the mindset of what an officer is experiencing under those situations. And it gets magnified when you break it down frame by frame, slow it down and analyze it. And then the expectations that are associated to that play-by-play are then increased on the officer. So it's very difficult, because the officers are saying, I've had situations where we brought in officers after a use of force situation, and we provided them with, or given them the opportunity to review the footage. And for them, they're walking through it sometimes, not realizing some of the actions they took. And to go back and actually think about that and process what was going on at the time is what's been really challenging for administration, who ultimately are responsible for any type of corrective behavior or discipline within the organization.
And this is a trivial comparison, or a very trivial proxy, but it's like football. You watch a guy drop a ball in slow motion, and you're like, why didn't he just place his hands there? Well, it's real time. Humans are flying at each other 1,000,000 miles an hour. The stress of it all. So yeah, it's sort of interesting. Like, it's easy for us as the public to sit back and say, oh, well, look at that situation. That shouldn't have happened like that. The officer is in it, making decisions in very real time. And yeah, I imagine the pressure of that all, making the perfect decision, has changed the game for officers.
Yeah, it has. And, and then dovetailing into, how are we as an organization then preparing our people and increasing their resiliency in those situations to ensure that at the end of that, at the conclusion of that very highly stressful unpredictability about that moment in time, how do we ensure that officers then go back, are given an opportunity to debrief, are given an opportunity to maintain their composure and get back on track? So making sure that we're not losing that officer, because, we're a very busy industry. There's a lot of calls for service and a lot of expectations that come with that. But, when dealing with an individual, keeping in mind that they're working in that 12-hour shift, is ensuring that they're good for the rest of the shift after that situation, from a mental health component. And then more importantly, I think, is that when that officer goes home, ensuring that they're in a good headspace, so that those days off are really truly about recharging that battery, giving them time to regroup, and then come back to work healthy and productive.
So we're saying that the environment has undoubtedly changed. It's gotten more stressful. There's more visibility. There's more eyes on people. There's more pressure to make the right decision. There's now precedent for officers going to jail if they do the wrong thing. That, I don't ever remember that being a thing, but it is now. And so the environment's changed. We know cases are going up. The other element to dissect is, has the officer changed? Like, it seems like there's more for supports. There's more for training. Do you do you think that the officers themselves, the makeup of the officers has changed at all? Is there something we can examine there?
I think the officers are more putting more thought into, how they react in situations, what course or direction do they take in those circumstances, knowing full well that it's going to be under the microscope for the next 6, 8, 12 months. So, and that apprehensiveness is what we're trying to eliminate a little bit, because we know that time is very precious for an officer in those situations where you can't slow it down. You don't have the ability to kind of go methodically, step by step through a situation. A lot of it is reacting from instinct. So I think that's the major challenge for us in administration, is saying that, yes, I think we understand that the pressures are there more so than ever before, that the expectations are there more so than ever before, that a lot of this stuff is being caught on, from our perspective, body cam and in-car camera systems, but also public, with social media accounts, with security video and footage being what it is today. There's not a street corner that you can't go down in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, that the likelihood of you getting caught on camera is very high. So, that's just adding to that level of stress and anxiety, I think, when officers are out doing their job on a day-to-day basis.
Is there like there's more education now and more training now, and I guess like what do you do with I guess let's start with there. Like, what are you trying to do that's different, or trying to create that resilience? The conditions have changed. The officers are highly resilient people, but I imagine these are situations where it's like one thing can greatly impact the career of an officer. Like one call that goes bad. I had a doctor say to me, an internist who's now retiring, highly respected internists, say, you're always one page away from the worst day of your life. That really struck me as an internist she deals with emergency situations in a hospital setting. I imagine it's similar for officers. You're one call away from the worst day of your life. And so how do you train and prepare people for that, like, unpredictability?
Therein lies the $1 million question. We talk about collaborations with external agencies, and I'm tired of that word. Collaborating is just what it seems to come down to is people being in a room for 2 hours, kickballing things around and never coming up with a solution. But I'm looking more for partnerships. I need to know that the investments that we're making as an administration today are actually doing something proactively to increase the resiliency of our officers. And part of that, though, is there has to be a recognition that I think what's happened here is the pendulum has shifted so much. Back in the day when nothing was done. So I go back 3 decades of policing where we weren't having these discussions, about increasing, even from a reactive nature. When we reacted to something, it was a result of actually looking at something and analyzing something that happened, but not reacting to the psychological component that's having on an individual's makeup, like their psychological DNA. Then that pendulum switched, and it seemed to go to the other side now, where we're defaulting and saying, well, inevitably this has had an impact on police officers. And we've seen things like presumptive legislation now that indicates that officers, in the absence of the contrary, they're going to, just by virtue of going through a particular circumstance now, are going to have some type of trauma associated from a mental health.
Oh, interesting. So the pendulum has swung to say everyone is going to experience this.
Correct.
Inevitably.
And I think with that shift, I think is now the emphasis is being thrown back on the organization to say, what are you doing about it? How are you going to protect the membership? And whether that's
organization being the police force, like it's up to you as the police chief they're saying, what are you going to do about it?
Okay. Right. Yeah. And that's coming from 2 different levels. Like that could be coming from a provincial body or even a national body that represents the interests of the men and women that put the uniform on. But that comes from the individual as well, where the individual is saying, well, what are you doing for me? I mean, you're asking me to put on a uniform, strap a gun, get into a patrol car and go into these tense situations. And you train me on how to pull the trigger on a gun. You train me on how to use a baton, pepper spray, and a taser. But how are you training me to deal with this from a psychological point of view? And that's where, there's a lot of good research being done on behalf of the Saskatchewan Federation of Police Officers, a lot of work with SIPCERT, you know. So I know that there's a lot of progress being done, but, you know, I recently picked up a document here, mental health programming framework for public safety personnel, that was done by SIPCERT. And, you know, there again, it's not saying that there's any off the shelf one model that you can buy, a plug and play approach for the organization that can say, hey, this is the investment we made, whether it be 50, 60, 100 grand, we've purchased this, now go ahead and use it. I think there has to be an acknowledgement on behalf of individual officers is that this is going to be a partnership. My mental health and well-being is a partnership between things that I do as an individual, proactive things, and I combine that with what's being provided by the organization to ensure that it's discipline specific, that it works within this group. Now, that's the challenge though here, is that officers that have been subjected to this now get into a clinical environment where there's patient doctor confidentiality issues about what that individual goes through to them. But what we do know and experiencing is that officers are no longer able to come back to the front line in the same capacity that they were originally hired. Yet nothing's being done with respect to a partnership to address what's happening on that front line. What was that trigger? Was it individual in nature? Was it something that I'm asking the same officer on a different shift to be subjected to? And until we start having those partnerships and having those discussions, I'm concerned that any of this, what we're building into the resiliency model, is not going to be as effective or impactful as we need it to be.
There's two things that I want to ask about there. One is, and we'll get to them both because I think they're big questions. The first is around prevention and training. Can you mandate that training? Like, you mandate almost every other type of training, right? Like how to use your gun safely, how to drive safely, like everything is mandated. Of course, you're officers of the law. Can you mandate that first of all, can you do that? Mandate that they have certain amounts of mental health and resilience training? And two, if you mandate it, can it be effective is the question. What's your sense of that?
I'm worried that if we mandating anything is not the right environment. You know, and I go back to sports analogy all the time, where I think that if you look at teams that are highly successful in winning championships, whether they be national, world, WHL, those teams, in my opinion, nothing's been mandated there. You know, to structure a power play. This isn't a mandated power play. To structure any type of sequence that needs to be done to achieve success. Teams that do well are the ones that where you have buy-in, where people want to participate because they recognize somehow that this is going to help. That's what we need to, in my opinion, that's what we need to create, that environment within our organization that I don't have to go out and say, you're mandated 2 hours per week. Here's the platform. You sign in, you check some boxes, you sign out, and we're good to go. Now, from an administrative point of view, that protects the organization because I can say, yep, this day, this time, check off these boxes.
Yeah.
But from a personal point of view, you know, I think I hope that we can recognize that if you truly want to have an impact, if you truly want to have momentum and inertia for an organization and something that is as important as this, you need to have buy-in. And that's where I'm struggling, is how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, and therein sort of lies the tension, because I think a lot of officers feel that they are resilient, at least resilient enough that they don't need that training until they sort of do need those preventative skills, and then maybe it's too late. Like I can tell you, somebody asked me the other day, because I do a lot of talks, and like over the course of adversity, I've done like hundreds of talks now, and I used to get really, really nervous before each talk, and I actually don't anymore. Like, I spoke to a group that was like, I don't know, 300 to 400 people. I didn't really get nervous before. It was more just fun. And then somebody asked me, do you still get nervous before talks? And I I said that yes, if that group intimidates me, like lawyers, they're very discerning people. The other group is if I speak in front of officers, it is very intimidating group, and they're a very stoic crew. Like you will not walk into as a psychiatrist a group of officers and see anything but arms crossed, leaning back, disengaged. So it's a tough group to engage. You've experienced this. So it's tough to convince them that like this is good for you because you may need it, right? That preventative piece that's a tough, that is the bridge. I'm not yet sure how to nail that bridge without making things, some of it at least mandatory, and then some of it like voluntary.
But let's go back to the talk about the pendulum swinging back where I think they're more so now than ever before as officers are recognizing that they're not superhuman. Okay. And that's, the impact of the job and what it's having on them. And it would be interesting to do a comparison between, officers that, got that 15 to 20 years service versus officers that are in their first 5 years of service when it comes to exposure and how you handle that exposure and how you prevent it there from there being a problem. But, new officers coming in now, I can say that we are investing in them more so than ever before on an awareness. I wouldn't go as far as to say that we're doing what we need to do to increase the resiliency of the group, but we're definitely engaged in having the discussions so that there's more of an awareness and what can you do beyond it. Now, if I got to be truthful, although we talk about this and we have an increase in awareness about it, I still think that we suffer a little bit in providing the actual response or resources that are proactive in nature, without some heavy investments that don't mean bringing in personnel that are now embedded within the organization that can provide. And the thing that's challenging within law enforcement is unless you've got a large organization that has the ability, financial ability, to go out and hire a consultant, a psychologist, mental health practitioner to bring within the organization to specify and devote time specifically to that organization. Your smaller organizations that run between that 80 to 150 personnel range are always trying to buy something that's economical, bring in an individual post-situation to try and alleviate the stresses involved with that particular situation. So this is where I would really love to see what does a framework look like? But once again, what are we building it for? If we're not getting the information back from clinicians to say that these are the things that are triggering, regardless of what an individual brings with respect to their own personal attributes to the job, being exposed to this, the consequence is potentially this. And I don't think we've done a good enough job at saying that, other than saying that law enforcement is being subjected to some pretty harsh things out in the field. But are there more specific things that we need to be aware of as an administrative group?
Yeah, so let's get into that because that's really interesting, and it seems like a hamster wheel situation where you have no doubt there is more pressure on physicians from all different types of, let's call them paramilitary, civil service, I don't know what the right term is, groups like firefighters, paramedics, officers, groups that serve the public under intense scrutiny and conditions. There's more pressure on physicians to say that there's a psychological safety claim and to approve it. And one of the strains there, I believe, is that you have your allegiance is to that patient, right? In that situation, you do have, some independent consultants do have and state right up front, hey, my allegiance or my, in some cases, paycheck for this assessment is coming from the military or the veteran affairs or this, or the city. And you're doing an independent analysis. But I can tell you that there's a lot of pressure from that individual who's advocating for themselves. And often they're advocating for time off, more lenient conditions. And so it's a really difficult practice. And I think that also sets up what you're saying is not a partnership currently, between the kind of three-legged stool between the police force, the patient, and that physician. There should be a partnership, and there isn't. I imagine you're seeing the same thing, that there's something there blocking like reasonable communication and reasonable planning for these officers who are coming back to work from a mental health leave.
It is. I think you hit the nail on the head when we started having those discussions. Administrations these days, in this, I get from talking to my cohorts at the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, where, this is a hot button topic for police leaders these days, is we know full well that we can't get into the personal situation of an individual that, is going through these types of things. And really it's none of our business. And that's, once again, that's between the patient and the doctor to work through. But when you look at it from an industry perspective, then the question is that what that individual is going through, is that something that's unique to that individual that doesn't allow them to be effective within this profession? Or was the trigger something that, on a scale of 1 to 10, that 8 people, regardless of their backgrounds, if subjected to the same situation, you can anticipate that your result would be similar? You've got extended time away from work, you've got modified return to duties. Because if that's the case, then we need to now, more so than ever, start engaging with one another to determine, well, what is it that we're asking and subjecting the men and women to? Because we need to change it then. Is it the way that going into a situation where they have to pull their sidearm and pull a trigger when it involves kids? Is it something, a different level, going to an accident scene where you have an individual that becomes belligerent and aggressive and you have to use force? So there's that sympathetic, aggressive type of component there that an individual is working from. And so these are the things that I think we really need to identify before we can start really investing in something that we think is going to work. Otherwise, we're just saying, hey, we're trying to build your resiliency. We're not sure what the outcome is going to be, but we're making an investment.
Yeah. And I want to back up some of the context for our listeners, because this is something you commonly deal with. It's something that a world that I've been involved in. But it's an increasingly common scenario now for officers to, and keep me honest here, for officers to go into a really difficult situation that involves violence, domestic violence, children being harmed, people who are, maimed or like a really bad trauma situation, physical trauma. So it's increasingly common for officers to see that and then have to do something in that really intense situation, maybe use force themselves. Like it's police officer work. It's very difficult work. And then it's increasingly common for officers to now go on a mental health leave because of the trauma that they experienced. I can't say how common it is, but it is increasingly common. That's all fair to say, right?
Right.
Okay. So then this other situation, the second half of that is these officers will get an assessment, an independent assessment from somebody like me. I don't do these assessments currently, but I have a lot of colleagues who do, from a psychiatrist, to essentially adjudicate whether it's right for this person to go on a short-term disability or a long-term disability. When they return to work from that mental health injury, then they will have accommodations, like maybe I can do this and can't do that. And so this whole framework, as I see it, was really set up for physical injuries. Like, you hurt your ankle, you go to an orthopedic surgeon and a physiotherapist and you can return to work. You just have to use crutches and be on a computer. Like, it makes it so much more straightforward with the physical injury. And it's really difficult for psychological injuries. Now, where the macro issue is, as I see it, as I've talked to a lot of administrators of programs like police forces, chiefs of police, and they say the costs are becoming exorbitant because they're carrying so many officers who are on long and short-term disability, that it's creating an exorbitant cost to have these officers on long-term disability and still have your working police force. So that's the context of where all this is coming from. Like, it's becoming so common that there's just a massive cost to the human and also the police forces. How are you approaching this? Like you're relatively new in this particular role. You've been in law enforcement for years. How are you thinking about it? How are you approaching it? Because you've always been, at least since I've known you, somebody who wants to look at new ways of doing things. You strike me as like there's a lot of, I think, administrative folks in your position who want to be protective and check a box and kind of do what's always been done. You strike me as the opposite of that type of individual. So how are you thinking about it? What do you think are some of the solutions here?
Full disclosure, I don't think that the upfront investment is actually investment in a product per se. I really do think that a person's mental health and well-being is built from the way that I feel when I come to work. Creating a culture and an environment within the organization that makes me feel supported, makes me feel appreciated, makes me feel like I want to come to work because I'm achieving something and goal. So our investment here locally has been in engagement, and there's if you're familiar with Daniel Pink's work at all, in Drive, there was a really good comment in there, a really good excerpt I took from it that we've been using in here. And it's something along the lines, I don't have the full quote in front of me, but something along the lines that, all too often organizations are built on compliance.
Sure.
Far too little engagement. And, the former gets us through the day, but the latter is what gets us through the night. And this is a quote that just seems so relevant for law enforcement, is that when we're here during the day, as an administrative group, we can stamp our feet, raise our hands, make sure that people are complying with policies, rules, and regulations. But more often than not, the most important decisions are being made when administration isn't around, when you need to rely on people to make sound judgment. And that comes through engagement from your management teams, so that the personnel that are working for them get a true appreciation and a feel that they're being supported. So the investment, full disclosure, the investment here up front is creating a culture and an environment where people want to come and work. And I think that that's the biggest impact that we're going to have on building resiliency, because it's a lot harder to come to a work environment and do the job and make the good decisions if I don't know if I'm going to be supported. Now, what makes it really challenging for a chief is that there's these external pressures that are saying, well, wait a minute, chief, you can't be just protecting your own. You can't make sure that every time there's a situation that you're not holding officers accountable, or you can't give the perception that you're always going to be voting in favor of the police officer. And I get that. So it's that delicate balance then of saying, listen, I'm going to invest in our people. We're going to be protective in situations about the things that they're subjected to. We're going to reach out. We're going to have discussions with medical health practitioners to ensure that we're doing what's best for this organization in particular. But if I keep running up to walls of bureaucracy and people saying, no, I'm not sharing, can't share, careful what you're asking for here, chief, because you're pushing the parameters of a human rights complaint. If you want to know why my individual client needs to have exposure therapy, why they can't be questioned with respect to access to their sidearm for fear that you as a chief think that client or that patient is going to go out and harm himself or others. When if you do a quick Google search right now, how many officers in Canada alone have taken their own life with their service issued sidearm? How do you then not sit back as a chief and say, well, I need to be aware of that.
Yeah.
And I need to ensure. So once again, partnerships then with external agencies to say, if you want to implement exposure therapy, here are some of the things that we need to work on with exposure therapy that alleviate any concerns that I have as a chief of police, to just say, hey, we're doing what's best in the interest of the officer, interest of the people that work within the building, and the interest of the external public. There's got to be a compromise there.
Is it too simplistic to say that you're trying to build a team that people want to be on? Because the problematic part of that, I'm just going to problematize it for a second, is that if you create a team that everyone wants to be on, that team is going against something or someone. There's an opponent, and that opponent can't be the public. Like, you also have to work, they have to be on the same team. Because if it's us versus them, then you get really even more adversarial. So how do you create that team dynamic, which is what you're saying is we want to create a team that people want to be on. They come to work excited. They are supported, which the evidence is vast, especially from the returning soldiers from World War II, from the Vietnam War. World War II soldiers returning, very well supported. You were on a team, you won, great job. Many fewer cases of PTSD. The Vietnam soldiers returning to the U.S., you're not on our team, you're baby killers, we're going to throw paint at you, we're going to riot about the war, you are not part of the U.S., very high levels of PTSD for those returning soldiers. So you're taking the evidence to say, we want to create a team that everyone's on. How do you do that without saying, yeah, we're on a team, but it's us versus them being the public?
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of the issue there is how do you do it? And once again, I think we've gotten to, especially as an industry, far too heavy reliance on technology, emails, text messages to communicate. We've lost the ability as an organization to engage on a personal level to ensure that an individual, I can send 10 emails with the really important message and content. And the one individual that I go talk to about that email will internalize it, will appreciate it, and will probably follow through with the request 10 times better than any of the other individuals that are going to get the email. So, I think that we've lost the ability, and much of it as a result of, in defense of just the requirements and the pressures now and the multitude of things that we're dealing with here, the inability to have a personal level, but that filters down. So instead of an administrative group having to go out and physically communicate on a personal level with every employee in the organization, those same messages can be sent through layers of supervision that can achieve the same goal. But you need to bring all those people on board, and you need them to understand. And the investment we've made is coming up with an operational plan that we are going to engage with the organization so they get a full appreciation for some of the goals and tactics that we're trying to accomplish. One being the mental health and resiliency of the organization. So let me talk in particulars here, because one of the hardest decisions that I've had to make. And now if I were to ask the general public as a chief, what do you think one of the hardest decisions as a chief I've had to make within the organization? And I get a multitude of different responses. People saying, oh, you had to maybe let some people go. You had to increase the size. You couldn't meet a budget on this. You had to review officers that may be an excessive force situation. I can tell you with some certainty and sincerity that one of the hardest decisions I've had to make is have to pull the plug on an internal mental health program for two reasons. One, there was a high financial responsibility associated to, but the most second part is there was no parameters or matrix that I could achieve to see it's being successful. I could not measure the return on investment to say that it's having an impact.
Yeah.
Where if we look at now the investments that we're making now with that engagement, having that feedback, how officers are coming to work, the number of grievances that are currently in the hopper, the amount of use of force that our officers are using, which can be subjective or suggestive, of, what the internal temperature of the morale is within your organization. So that's where the investments are being made here locally.
You can tell, or at least as a proxy, what was the wording you used? External or excessive use of force. You believe, or you have some evidence to show that that's a proxy for how the culture is performing?
Potentially,
that's interesting.
Yeah. Once again, without any type of verifiable truth, but you put yourself into a situation, if an individual is not in a healthy space in dealing with a tense situation, they're not going to have the faculty to use all their resources, their ability to use verbal judo, to talk their way down out of a situation, to de-escalate a situation without having to use force. We're all individuals, we're all humans. And if you're not in a good spot and the ability to reflect and quickly react and use good judgment, because it's being impacted by negative culture and negative morale within your association, then maybe you resort to force quicker. Your temper, your fuse is shorter, your temper is shorter because you feel that you're not being supported, or your instinct to react is just based on an unhealthy work environment versus a healthy one. So what's the correlation between the two? Don't know yet. But keeping tabs on what's going on with respect to complaints against police officers, use of force situations for police officers. I think unless you look at it from a wide lens, you won't get a true appreciation for what's going on within your organization.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense to me. And I love the approach that you're taking. It's sort of less technology based. It seems old school, like build a team, build an internal culture that people are proud of and also want to come to work to. And therein, you can make a more resilient workforce. People are better internally, better with their families, more engaged. They can deal with all the strains and stressors of the public, which we're saying are only getting worse, and we can expect them to get worse and higher pressure. But what you can control and then also measure is how you're taking care of your people internally. So that's an interesting approach, and I don't think you'll get any awards for that being the most high tech approach. But it might work. Well, it's working. It sounds like. So that's really motivating to hear. Is that scalable to larger? Like you're working with 100-ish officers. Is that scalable to forces that are working with 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 officers?
I think it is to some degree. I think that there's layers there, and if you've got a good plan about how you address it as a layer, then I think it can have a compounding effect, as it trickles down. It's always been my concern that unless you're the one delivering the message will not be heard in the way that you want it to be taken. But I think as administrators, we have to realize that, if you're a chief of police for 2,500 plus, what layer are you going to have the biggest impact on in ensuring that, that the things that you're trying to implement within your organization are going to be followed through in a manner that is consistent with you sending a message that helps build the morale within the culture. And that's where the investment needs to be from an administrator. So very fortunate in that I can deliver the message, and I can rely on, daily interactions with the executive team here to ensure that we stay on tabs. Maybe a little more challenging for individuals in larger organizations where there's always a bit of divergence from the intent in spirit of the original message, the more often that it's told as it goes down the line. But I'd love to, once again, how powerful would it be if, let's take in our situation that, 5 individuals that have experienced something as a result of wearing the uniform that does not allow them to be in a healthy mindset. How powerful would it be if there was some statistical feedback and or analysis that allows me to maybe develop, is there a correlation between this, that, or otherwise? Mm-hmm. To go back then and say, on a proactive stance, we don't have to mention the officer's name, but we can talk about a situation. And if there was an ability to say that of the 5 officers that have been subjected to it, there's commonalities in 3 of those situations. And in 3 of those situations, it was X, Y, or Z. And you as an administration have an impact on X, Y, and Z to change it, to manipulate it, to pivot on it so that the exposure is potentially different, but we're not getting that now. That's what we need to happen. So, I'm reaching out and looking to, for support and guidance in, all right, how can we achieve those goals? And if so, how do you go about it? Once again, making sure that when it comes to confidentiality, when it comes to contracts, legal obligations, that we're not violating anything in particular.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you dropping into chat with us today about this. And I think we could talk more about the tension between the medical field too, because I think there's something there. And that, yeah, I think that merits another discussion. And yeah, I mean, I appreciate your approach to this. I appreciate you trying to dig into the issues with us, because there's so much there. There's a lot there that people don't think about. We interact with law enforcement once in a while, and we just see our side of it. So I think it was really good for our listeners to hear about the stressors and strains of it, and also the real practicalities of how we can improve the mental health of our officers, so we can have more officers, so we can have safer communities. So yeah, thanks for dropping in to chat with us. It was a super interesting conversation, and there's, I think, more to talk about one day when it comes to the medical profession and what we can do better on our side to help out.
Well, thanks for having me. And, once again, maybe I'll end it with this. And we talked about the need for that personal interaction. And, as an organization that had implemented adversity and tried to build the resiliency of our organization, platform that I think has a lot of merit to it and a lot of ability to provide, there is still a human component that's required to get it across the goal line and achieve success. And that is, once again, from an internal perspective, it's building ownership in it, so that there's a consistent message that's coming from, rather than mandating it, there's a consistent message coming from managers saying, this is valuable, it means something, let's talk about it, let's utilize it. That's when you get best return on your investment. So
yeah, the human issue in the end. So I agree. And coming from leadership, we've seen it be very powerful. So I really appreciate that note.
No,
okay. Chief, thanks for dropping in today. I appreciate the chat.
100%, anytime. Looking forward to the next one.
Okay, talk soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye.